My one critique of this administration is that the messaging discipline is very poor, and we're not sure actually what the policy is. And I say that not to carry water for them. I carry water for nobody except the Institute for the Study of War. But um, uh, I actually don't know what the policy is.
Hello and welcome to Frontline, Times Radio's interview series about the war in Ukraine and global security. I'm James Hansen, and today I'm delighted to be joined by George Barros from the Institute for the Study of War. George, it's always a pleasure. Welcome back to Frontline.
Hey, James, good to see you again. Thanks for having me once again.
As ever, a lot to talk about when it comes to the war in Ukraine. We'll come on to the possibility of a peace deal in due course. But first of all, I wanted to get your assessment of what we're seeing actually on the front line still, because it's worth remembering this is still very much a hot war. And I know the Institute for the Study of War has been doing some research into what 2025 could mean for Russia, and in particular the challenges facing Vladimir Putin and the Russian military. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the war still remains dynamic. It is not hopelessly stalemated. I would note that in positive news, the Russian offensive operations around their main area of advance, which is in Donetsk Oblast near Pokrovsk, is slowed down in recent weeks. Really starting in late 2024, around November, December, but also continuing into January and February, the tempo of Russian gains around the outskirts of Pokrovsk has slowed down. The Ukrainians have engaged in some tactical counterattacks to alleviate pressure on that Russian salient coming up around southern outskirts of Barros, and that's promising. It seems that campaign is slowly petering out. Their daily rates of advance are slowing down, so this is a positive sign. I'd also note for you that it seems like in 2025, the Russians might begin prioritizing operations to intensify their attacks slightly to the north of Pokrovsk. We've seen some indications that the Russians are redeploying the units that were fighting in the southern part of Donetsk near Vuhledar, and also some units that were previously in the Pokrovsk-Kurakhova area that they're redeploying towards Toretsk and towards the Chasiv Yar area. And this might suggest that the Russians might be preparing to intensify operations against what we call Ukraine's fortress belt of cities. Those large-scale, heavily fortified, long-time cities like Slovyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinivka, etc. And we might see the Russians in the summer campaign season attempt to slog it out there. But again, we're not forecasting any major operational breakthroughs. It would likely be more relatively slow warfare of a mostly positional nature, grinding attritional warfare. Neither side has figured out how to restore operational maneuver to the battlefield. Now, as for the 2025 vulnerabilities, I think you've touched on here a very important discussion that we should have, which is the United States, I think, actually holds a lot of cards, and Ukraine holds a lot of cards in shaping what a peace deal, what a termination of the conflict looks like with Russia. Russia has serious problems on the horizon. They are not acutely affecting Russia today, right now. But Putin in 2022 and over the last 2 years has sowed the seeds of instability because he has made decisions that really mismanaged a numerically and qualitatively superior economy, a larger military, and a larger population base and demographics, to the point where actually a protracted war and further continuation of the war under the current terms becomes increasingly unstable. I'll touch on these very briefly. I think we've talked about this before, but the burn rate in Ukraine, I mean, these gains that the Russians have made have been absolutely unsustainable. In raw numbers, from Avdiivka, which fell in February of 24, to the current front line in southern Pokrovsk, Russia's main effort, the Russians advanced a grand total of 55 kilometers over the course of about 14 months. They lost over 5 armored divisions worth of equipment, over 500 tanks, over 1,000 armored personnel carriers, tens of thousands of troops. This is not a worth it trade. If you just sort of look at the metrics, a division should be able to cover a frontage of this many kilometers and be reasonably expected to advance this far. That's not a good pace. It's actually quite glacial. And, for the Russians to be able to seize all of Ukraine, I don't think that's necessarily what the Russians are going to do. But at the current tempo, it takes them 83 years, assuming they can maintain the current intensity, which is not the case given how we see them petering out around Pokrovsk. Russia's defense industrial base does not produce new tanks at scale with new serial production. They crank out there's one factory that does it. and it cranks out between maybe 30 tanks a month or up to 90 tanks a year. The estimates vary, but that's the range. Russian tanks that we see continuously getting destroyed on Ukraine's battlefields, those are Soviet-era tanks taken from Soviet-era long-term storage, which is a finite resource, and which, according to the best open-source geospatial intelligence, indicates that they're going to run critically low on these infantry fighting vehicles and tanks in about a year, provided the tempo continues. Let's talk about how they actually get the men into those vehicles. Putin made a huge mistake in resourcing this war. In 2022, he should have used the monopoly of violence the Russian government has over its people to coerce hundreds of thousands or millions of Russians to go fight in Ukraine. But Putin didn't do that. Putin cares about his regime stability and his promises to the Russian people. Putin instead created a social contract with the Russians, which is, I will not coerce you to fight in Ukraine. I will bribe you I will pay you off to go fight in Ukraine. And so I will pay you money with these sign-on bonuses and financial incentives to voluntarily go, so that when you're killed or wounded, you don't complain, because that was part of the deal. That was a tremendous mistake, because that could work for a short-term war, a 3-day military operation, even maybe a year or 2-year long war. But it's not work for a 3 or 4 or 5-year protracted war, because it destroys the Russian economy. The liquidity portion of Russia's sovereign wealth fund has decreased precipitously since 2022. Before the war, the liquidity portion was about $96 billion, if I remember correctly. It's now down to closer to $46 billion, and economists here in Washington, some of them forecast that their liquid reserves will run out by the end of this year, all things kept the same. Putin can continue paying off people to go fight in Ukraine, but people are a limited resource too, and the number of humans that are actually either economically desperate enough to take that deal, or the people that realize that actually most people that take that deal end up getting killed relatively quickly, it is growing. And so what we see now is that actually the recruiter is responsible for getting the 30 to 45,000 Russians per month that the Russians recruit. They're starting to complain to Moscow, and they're starting to say, hey, we're not able to meet the quotas anymore. Can we please lower these sort of things? I read the North Koreans joining the fight back in November, December as an indication that the Russians are looking for alternative sources to get boots on the ground. And so Putin will, at the current loss rates, he will have to call another round of mobilization like he did in fall 22. But that's not a get out of jail free card, because the Russians are also trying to manage a labor deficit of 1 million workers right now. And so you can certainly mobilize more people, but that's going to come at the expense of, you're going to have to pay them off. You're going to have to pay off their families when they're killed or wounded. And you're going to be robbing Peter and the domestic economy to pay Paul for taking people into fight in Ukraine. And so really, the approach should be, look, the longer we protract this war, the closer the Russians run to running out of steam with their Soviet-era vehicles, the closer they run out to their liquid currency reserves running critically low, the more acute their labor shortage problems become, as the Russians continue to lose 30 to 45,000 casualties per month. And this will force Putin to have to make some very difficult decisions. I don't know how he's going to mitigate it. I'm sure he'll find ways to mitigate, but he will be forced to make decisions and make trade-offs. And really, look, trying to end the war and conclude it right now, before these factors can really mature to a place where it puts the Russians into a binder, would be a mistake. I mean, we can really extract a good deal the longer we keep the Ukrainians in the fight, and that also includes not just the United States keeping them in the fight, but the Europeans keeping them in the fight. I mean, we're at the point now where every day counts. It's the closer you drive the Russians to this hard place, and every day that the Russians get the deal sooner than they want, then they get to evade this potential bundle of problems.
Have, whether it's manpower or supplies or the economic problems facing the Russian economy, and sort of when will the crunch point come? And in your view, if the fighting continues further into 2025, certainly towards the end of 2025, that crunch point is very soon.
I can't tell you, sort of like, when's the second of Christ coming? I can't tell you the day nor the hour, but the current estimates that we have, best that we can do with our analysis is, I can't tell you the day or the hour, but this 12 to 18 month period, all the factors are aligning to this being a very difficult time. And I think it's why Putin's being very aggressive with trying to get a deal right now. I mean, because he wants to evade. He would prefer to not have to deal with it and fight it head on. He would prefer to sort of evade it with a ceasefire, because as soon as there's a ceasefire or an operational pause or an armistice, whatever you want to call it, the key thing is the tempo goes down and the Russians stop losing what they're losing. Then he can evade it.
I mean, it's interesting. Obviously, sitting in Washington from your perspective, George, you can see that. You can recognise that the fundamental weakness of the Russian position. And yet, as we know, there's a certain man sitting in another office in Washington who sees it very differently and seems to believe that the Russians are either in a stronger position than they obviously are, or whether he just sympathises with them for whatever reason. How frustrating do you find it as someone who can identify the underlying weakness of the Russian position, that at the moment it appears the Trump administration doesn't seem to see it that way?
So, look, I think the Trump administration, they want to have a peace deal, which I think is in principle a good thing. Everyone wants the fighting to stop. I would prefer that it's a version of the fighting where it stops, where the Russians don't win in part or in whole. But in principle, terminating this conflict is a good thing. We should terminate it on terms that advance American interests. Selfishly, I say that as an American, and we should advance it on terms that advance Ukraine's national security interests, because those are deeply interlinked with America's national security interests. And we should terminate on terms that actually do not further Russian national interests, because the Russians are adversaries. Now, I think this administration, I think Donald Trump, particularly on the campaign trail, I mean, it's not a particularly novel idea to say we should take politicians when they're stumbling on the campaign trail and then politicians when they're actually in power and governing. They're very different people, and that's not unique to our current president. He, to a fault on the campaign trail, was talking about how quickly he would get a peace deal in place. He said it would be done before the inauguration was complete. You'd get it done on day one. He's currently saying it'll be done within 100 days or within, like 6 months or something. And this is positive. This is good, because he's realizing that actually these are complex issues, that actually a better deal can be made as time progresses. And so obviously it didn't happen before Inauguration Day. It didn't happen on day one. We're now, a month into it. So if he said it was going to take him 100 days, he's basically 1/3 through that. Like, I think as he studies the facts and gets, back briefed and read into all the dynamics, he can, and as they send the negotiators to Riyadh to go talk to the Russians and stuff, they can actually realize that, actually, Putin's not interested in negotiating, because words matter. Negotiation implies both sides make concessions and you come to this middle point. But the Russians have explicitly said, even just yesterday, on the anniversary of the war, Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, and the deputy Russian foreign minister, Ryabkov, they articulated that they're not interested in anything other than their initial demands. Ryabkov says that they want to get to the root causes of what caused this in the first place, which is they don't believe Ukraine should be a sovereign country that can choose to join its own alliances and have freedom of association. And they don't want other NATO states like Poland and Lithuania and Latvia to be within the alliance. And they said, if we don't figure these root causes of the conflict out, then we can't have a deal. And so what Putin is presenting to us and what he presented to Marco Rubio and Steve Witkoff and the other negotiators in Riyadh last week was essentially, here's the deal. Moscow gets everything we've been demanding since 2021. The United States makes a series of concessions. The Ukrainians get completely screwed over by this deal, and then we'll shake hands and call it a negotiation. That's not a negotiation. Actually, the Russians should be forced to make some concessions, and I think the Trump administration is realizing that actually a quick deal, a good deal, the kind of deal that he was promising in terms of its speed and rapidity on the campaign trail, we shouldn't allow the quick deal to be the enemy of the best deal. And the best deal is a deal where we let the Russians mature in this problem set and then use it on them to force them to make concessions. Otherwise, there's no deal. And also, there's principles. I mean, unfortunately, Steve Witkoff just the other day on Sunday gave an interview with CNN where he talked about how the 2022 Istanbul Accords would have been the basis of he called them guideposts. It would be a guidepost for the new negotiations. And unfortunately, if you interrogate the substance of those Istanbul Accords, it cannot serve as the basis of a negotiation. There's a reason why it failed in 2022. Because the terms are completely unacceptable. And ISW, we just published a fact sheet about those accords yesterday, in fact.
We hope you're enjoying today's episode of Frontline. Don't forget, you can also now listen to Frontline in podcast form. Just search for The World in 10 from wherever you get your podcasts, where you can also hear daily analysis of the biggest stories relating to war and defence. And we'll put a link to The World in 10 in the description below. So what, in your view, George, is the minimum viable requirement for a peace deal if you're looking at it from a Ukrainian perspective?
If you don't mind, I'm going to tell you what it should be from an American perspective. I think they're actually aligned more so than not. But the Ukrainians will demand certain things. I don't want to put words in their mouth, but I'm as an American, someone here in Washington, and interact with the policymakers, I'll tell you what it should be from an American perspective. There's bare minimum requirements, principles that we must not compromise on. The first one is that Ukraine must be a sovereign state. Putin, the minute that we get into a debate about, well, here's the map and here's where the new Russian line is, and here's where the new Ukrainian line is, and like that's that, and we get wrapped around the geography of it, we've made a critical mistake, because Putin's not just interested in the geography. He seeks a referendum on how we conduct business after World War II in Europe and the world. It's that countries have borders, they're sovereign, they can make decisions, that sort of thing. Putin doesn't believe that. Putin believes in spheres of influence, that there are basically only truly sovereign countries, which are great civilizational powers like China and Russia and the United Kingdom and the United States, perhaps. And then there's these other little things like Lithuania and Ukraine and Romania and Slovakia, which are not truly sovereign countries. They call themselves sovereign countries, but they're not truly sovereign. And they don't truly have freedom of association. They can't truly join things. And I disagree with that. I mean, I think they're sovereign countries. Like, they have agency. They should be allowed to make their decisions. They're just, they don't have nuclear weapons, but they're just as legitimate as the United Kingdom and the United States and Russia. So in saying Ukraine categorically cannot join NATO, cannot categorically join the European Union, cannot develop certain kinds of weapon systems, that would put in positions on Ukraine where actually they're not indeed a sovereign state. They don't get to exercise the responsibilities that we would afford any sovereign country. So Ukraine must emerge sovereign. They might be able to make territorial concessions. I would like them to not have to make territorial concessions. There's a model for how to do that in principle. The Baltic states, Western governments, particularly the United States, we never recognized the Soviet occupation of the Baltic states in the late 1930s, the beginning of World War II. We didn't recognize it for the entirety of the Cold War. We can do that for Ukraine, but Ukraine must emerge sovereign. That's condition one. Condition two is we must have there be a robust security guarantee so that we can deter a future attack against Ukraine. That needs to come from a nuclear power. It can come from the United States. It can come from France. It can come from the United Kingdom. But we have to have a skin in the game, and we have to commit to defending Ukraine in the future. I actually don't necessarily think it can be NATO. I don't think Ukraine should want NATO, because NATO, good as it is actually not the most kind of robust deal that you can get. I think what Ukraine should want is something closer to what the United States gave Japan in the mid 20th century, which is a bilateral security guarantee. And if you study the language of the treaty between the United States and Japan, it's actually much more robust than what we offer in NATO. If a country attacks Japan and if Japan invokes the treaty, then the United States is actually obliged by treaty to help defend Japan. There's none of this procedure that happens in NATO, which is you have to call Article 4, and then you can be in the Council, and then you have to decide whether or not to invoke Article 5, and then even then it's more or less a coalition of the willing, and they have to choose how to respond, which may or may not be a military response. It's very mushy, actually. And Ukraine, anything that's mushy like that, I think the Russians will be able to exploit. So it needs to be robust, and the model is really the Japan deal. The third and final component of this, which is Putin has to actually take a loss. Putin cannot emerge from this process feeling that basically it was a net win. Maybe not, instead of scoring 10 points, he only scored 3 points. If he feels like if he won in part or in whole, then it's a failure, because he will have learned from this that basically, although he paid a steeper price at the negotiation table or, in his military losses than he would have liked to, he got more out of it than what he put into it. It was actually a net fruitful exercise. And that will fail to deter him from conducting future military operations against Ukraine, especially if we compromise on principle 2. But not only against Ukraine, but against other states. in particular, the Baltic states and Finland and Poland. I'm very concerned about Russian preparations for a larger scale war against those countries in the near future. And so Putin must make these concessions. And any sort of deal, therefore, that makes concessions on Ukraine's sovereignty, secure, robust security guarantees for Ukraine to deter a Russian attack in the future. And if we basically make this be somehow profitable for Putin in a way that it incentivizes him to attack again, any such deal must be a non-starter to begin with. And needless to say, any deal where the mediating party or the enforced mechanism has to go through the United States, or pardon me, the UN Security Council, where Russia and China have vetoes, non-starter. That is also a non-starter.
So on the second of those three conditions, George, this idea of a robust security guarantee, I mean, Keir Starmer, the UK Prime Minister, has talked about having a US backstop. So, providing potentially British, maybe French troops, peacekeeping troops on the ground in Ukraine, but with the threat of American oversight. I don't know whether that would be air power or whether that would be a US commitment to deploy if there was some kind of incursion. Can you see Donald Trump going for a US backstop currently? Because all the mood music in the past week or so has been that he wants to wash his hands of Ukraine. He doesn't want there to be really any significant US involvement in Ukraine at all.
My one critique of this administration is that the messaging discipline is very poor, and we're not sure actually what the policy is. And I say that not to carry water for them. I carry water for nobody except the Institute for the Study of War. But I actually don't know what the policy is. Marco Rubio gave an interview, and the New York Times had a great report of this over the weekend, where Marco Rubio said that the Trump administration's goal is to have Ukraine emerge as a sovereign state that can defend itself, and that is good after this. Our Treasury Secretary was talking about how we want to have increased American linkages and involvement in Ukraine through the mineral deal, which in principle is a good thing. And if we have American companies there working and American businesses in there, so presumably we're going to protect those Americans, right? Which is in principle, a good thing. Part of the reason why I think this mineral deal needs to go through, especially in a manner that it actually does help provide those security guarantees to Ukraine. At the same time, we have other officials like Steve Witkoff talking about how the completely non-starter Istanbul agreements should serve as guideposts. And we have Elon Musk, whose relationship and position in the chain of command for Ukraine negotiations, I do not understand. He's been saying a variety of things with very little discipline on Twitter, and the extent to which he's actually has more or less authority than Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who's a senator, who is a Senate confirmed cabinet level position. I actually don't know. And so if you look at the sort of the scatterboard of where all the various different Trump officials are, there are stronger positions, there are stronger in principle acceptable things that certain leaders have said. And then there's other leaders who have said things that actually seem contradictory to that. And part of the fact sheet that we published yesterday was actually pointing out how Steve Witkoff's position about the Istanbul protocols providing a guidepost in particular for the negotiations, that actually runs contrary to what Marco Rubio said and what other Trump officials have said about Ukraine emerging as a sovereign state. Because actually the Istanbul Accords would force the Ukrainians to amend their constitution to be a permanently neutral state. And it would impose Treaty of Versailles-like limitations on caps on the size of the Ukrainian military and what kind of, it would ban Ukraine from having any kind of foreign troops or presence in there. So when Pete Hegseth went to Ramstein the other week and said that there should be a European peacekeeping force in Ukraine. Well, that's actually banned by the Istanbul Accords. So I actually don't know what the policy is. It's a little bit of a head scratch, trying to figure it out. And it's my hope that what we're looking at is a policy that's actually the stronger version, that's closer to what Hegseth and Rubio said, and further away from what Elon Musk and what the Istanbul Accords would stipulate. So we have to, I think, we got to figure out what the actual policy is, because it's all over the place.
No, I mean, you're right. I mean, only yesterday when President Macron met Donald Trump in the Oval Office, I think Trump said that he thinks Putin would have no problem, I think was the language he used, with a European peacekeeping force in Ukraine. Now, I'm sure Vladimir Putin probably would have a problem with that, but at the moment that seems to be the language that Trump is using, but it does change a lot. Just on the mineral deal, George, I mean, it's interesting that you say you think that should go through, because there's this kind of ongoing debate. On the one hand, some people say, look, this is kind of naked colonialism from the US. This is them trying to exploit Ukraine in its hour of need to plunder its natural resources. I suppose the counter argument, the more realpolitik argument, would be, look, you've got to give the US a reason to defend Ukraine down the line. You've got to give them some skin in the game. And if you've got American contractors on the ground in Ukraine taking advantage of the country's mineral resources, that in the long term will be beneficial for Ukraine's security. And is that very much your view?
It's a very nuanced question. We've been talking for years, so you know that I'm not a fan of anything that would exploit the Ukrainians. I've been arguing that the United States should support the Ukrainians from our own pocket because it's actually in our interest to. But it's the Ukrainians that actually suggested a mineral deal in the first place. I think that's been lost in the whole story and in the drama surrounding this report. This was not an idea cooked up by Washington. This was actually proposed by the Ukrainians in Yermak and Kiev. They pitched it to the new administration when it came over because they understand that the liberal values and here's why you should continue spending a lot of money in defense in Europe and stuff, those are fundamentally not compelling arguments to this new administration. One of the arguments that is compelling is, look, there's critical resources, and if it's a question between the United States and the Western powers can have access to it, or the Chinese and the Russians and the Iranians can have access to it, that is actually a more compelling argument for this administration. So it was the Ukrainians that proposed that. And conveniently, the Trump administration, they've not been categorically opposed to sending weapons to Ukraine. It's never been, we hate the Ukrainians, they're terrible, let's cut them off. It's been, this costs too much money, so we have to find an alternative revenue stream. And the minerals deal, in addition to the let's give it to the United States as opposed to Russia and China and Iran, it also can be, hey, this can offset the financial costs of providing the weapons. So it sort of solves that policy and financing challenge as well. So for those reasons, the mineral deal is very important in that it can help us get beyond the financing problem. The other way to get around the financing problem is we have to go after the Belgians and actually seize the assets, the frozen assets, and not just the interest, but go after the principal, which the Belgians are not willing to do at this time. But the minerals can help finance the weapons, and the Ukrainians rightfully understand that they need the weapons to survive. It's incredibly important for maintaining that burn rate, for ensuring that the Russians keep losing 45,000 to 30 casualties per month, and getting the Russians closer to that critical problem stage and maturing in those issues. The weapons are the key ingredient to all of this. And so without the weapons, the Ukrainians will be able to get us closer to that sustainable end state. And so for those reasons, the deal should go through. Now, there's versions. Now, they're negotiating the terms. There's a version of the deal which is more exploitative, which is what the Russians are trying to do to poison pill it, which is, hey, yeah, the United States can come and work in occupied Russia and get minerals from Ukraine and help develop it, which would essentially give Russian sanctions relief and help the Russians make money and plunder Ukrainian resources, while also, in a way, sort of de facto acknowledging Russian occupation over Ukrainian territory. That's a bad version of the minerals deal. And then there's good versions of the minerals deal, which are like, as part of a European and American joint force somewhere in Ukraine, we're going to help the Ukrainians get back their territories and get those minerals. That's a good version of the deal. And it also implies some war fighting to go liberate Ukrainian territory. And then there's versions of the deal which are like, we're not going to help you liberate the minerals, but those minerals that you do have, we'd like to have access to some of that. And in exchange, we're going to help give you security guarantees and forces and that sort of thing to decisively deter and, if necessary, defeat another Russian attack. That's a better version of the deal. So I hope that the terms are good. I hope that it's terms that are not nakedly just pure colonial exploitation of Ukraine. Just because we're trading minerals for financing of weapons doesn't mean that it is ipso facto exploitative.
Just finally, George, zooming out a bit, some of the big institutions we talk about all the time, whether it's NATO or the United Nations, do they really count for anything now? Are we moving into a new era? Over the centuries, there have been different mechanisms to try and maintain the balance of power, particularly in Europe. After the Napoleonic Wars, it was the concerts of Europe that held, broadly speaking, until about the 1870s. You had the League of Nations pretty unsuccessfully trying to maintain the balance of power between the two world wars of the 20th century. And then for the best part of 80 years now, we have had these big supranational institutions like the UN, like NATO. Do they mean anything now, or are we moving into a new era?
I think they still matter. but they're insufficient if they're not actually going to be backed up with political will to defend them when adversaries contest them. So, look, if NATO is on a magic shield, we talked about Article 4 and Article 5, and actually an attack against NATO doesn't automatically precipitate a confirmed response. In fact, the Russians, with their assassinations in the UK and elsewhere, and their sabotage and their cutting of cables and blowing of ammunition depots all across Europe, their missiles flying into Poland, Polish and Romanian airspace, those are de facto acts of war. They're acts of war against NATO countries, which we conveniently decide for practical reasons to ignore. But the Russians could do something else. They could go seize part of a territory, and it doesn't mean we're ipso facto going to war. If NATO is indeed a paper tiger and we allow the Russians to bully us and push us around, then yeah, the institution doesn't matter. But we have to be prepared to stand by the principles. We have to be prepared to have skin in the game and do the things that the institutions imply. And so in that regard, I think NATO as an institution is still relevant. It does matter. Other institutions like the UN, I think, do fundamentally matter. But let's not kid ourselves. Our adversaries abuse them. Russia and China, they abuse their positions on the UN National Security Council in order to try to create and establish a variety of peace deals, which on paper sound good because then it'll get mediated by this legitimate and prestigious institution. But in reality, the Russians have a whole plan for how to be able to wreck these deals from beginning to end. And we have to take that into account and not be too idealistic about what we have to be realistic about the limitations of the institutions. But the institutions do matter. If we know their limitations and actually use them as we're supposed to and put skin in the game.
George, we always appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us again on Frontline.
Thanks for having me, James. Always a pleasure.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.